Extras. When they got back to Bankton, Angel received a pleasant surprise from her contact. As news had spread through the organization about the mistake with the bounty, not that big a deal. Angel's encounter with Orc the Executioner, not that big a deal, because she sewed the sign and he stayed his hand. And her encounter with Mahran Doraj, which was a huge deal because word had gotten out that he had attacked Angel and that she'd ended up taking his signature flaming spike chain, though it could have been a much bigger deal if they had revealed that the halfling was actually Secret Twin Assassins. They had kept that part to themselves. Regardless, after these incidents, another member of the organization, passing through Bankton, had left a little something for her, just sort of a show of solidarity. What kind of get-well card do you leave a mercenary or assassin? A poison recipe. Demonac, who is a real, authentic South Varangian ninja, spends most of his time doing what very few people have the guts to do, resisting the KTs in his conquered homeland. How he has survived so long was a real mystery until, thanks to the rope trick incident, the players learned that Kuo-toa can't see an invisible or well-hidden target if it remains perfectly still. Now, although Demonac is an expert, a goddamned artist, with poisons, the fact is KTs are immune to any known poison. This new recipe called Devil's Blood is no exception. But he figured Angel would appreciate it, because it's a pretty effective weapon poison, sufficiently resistant to oxidization that one application can last for hours until it is used, but mainly because the main ingredient comes from a spleen-like Kuo-toan organ. Kill 10 KTs? Get a batch of poison. Actually, it was around this time that I made up some poison crafting and trap creating rules for Angel, who has some skills in those areas. I gave her a list of basic poisons and material costs, and a short list of more exotic poisons that require ingredients she'd have to find rather than just buying them. Ankeg jaws, a root ball from a bluethorn plant, or the ingredient for the most brutal poison she knows, a black lotus blossom, which can only be found in the Shadowfell. Both the traps and poisons cost some money's worth of components to make, and start out strong enough, I thought, to be useful combat bonus for something it only took skill ranks to produce. But they also had rules for increased effectiveness if you beat the craft DC by a sizable margin. As it turned out, though, Angel hasn't gotten much use out of them, partially due to the lack of downtime for crafting things, the situational nature of some of the traps, and the many poison-immune opponents, from Kuo-toa to spoilers, to other spoilers. Man, they fought so many spoilers. She's still looking for that Black Lotus, though. Around this time, as the party began to accumulate more and more money, multiplying that money's effectiveness with Draven's crafting skills and extra cost discounts, I introduced them to a new rule. Items with a market price of 35,000 gold or greater in this world can only be crafted by expending an additional component we call an item of power. These can be things like an important item wielded by an ancient hero, or by a god while in mortal form, or they may be a body part from a particularly powerful magical creature, like the hands of a monitor, or the heart of a colossal hydra. As GM, at my prerogative, I can rule that crafting a given item would require a specific quest item, but generally for gear with a base value under 75k, you can use any item of power in the crafting, and you can choose whether to incorporate the item of power physically into the weapon or amulet or whatever you're making, or you can choose to simply break down the item of power as part of the crafting process, depending on whether you want it to show up or not in your gear. Dragons are, of course, a common mythical source of such components, such as that used to make the famous dragon spine bow wielded by Vanar, a compatriot of the smith. I ruled that the scales from Little One's mother would work as an item of power for any armor crafted by him because of the personal connection. After all, he did drag everyone on a quest for them. Obviously, he doesn't have normal magical crafting feats, but we make certain allowances for non-casters to craft magic items at normal crafting costs, using appropriate materials and an appropriate crafting skill, and Little One has good blacksmithing ability. Plus, if it were a major balance issue, we know clearly Draven could do the main crafting for whatever item, and multiple characters can already collaborate to meet the prerequisites for items according to standard DMG rules. Allowing magic items to be produced by crafting skills, substituting time or numbers of craftspeople for the spellcasting and feats normally required, actually helps make the world make sense, too. Is every Ring of Feather Falling really crafted by a 12th level wizard? Is that how they spend their time? Or does it make more sense for a jeweler with a recipe and the right materials to have made it by dedicating a little bit of his time for many years to perfecting this project? Most +1 or +2 swords are the pinnacle of a lifetime of practice by a master craftswoman, or maybe they're produced regularly by a king's staff of dedicated craftsmen for his personal guard, rather than a project that a 5th level wizard or cleric spent resources on, unless your world is so high magic that 5th level casters are common. So, Little One's mother was a dragon. And not just any dragon. As mentioned in a video, she played a pretty large part in the efforts to reverse the Diluvian invasion of Verandi. And sure, she freed thousands of slaves and literally routed entire armies in some cases with her high-altitude diving strafing runs, and her pair of powerful breath weapons, including lightning powerful enough to wound or outright kill Kuatoa, the species so innately resistant to electricity that they don't even think twice about casting lightning bolt spells through their own troops in battle. But she couldn't have made as much impact if they didn't come out in force, if they had just broken into small groups and spread throughout the countryside hunting down the humans. The reason the powerful empire had to keep treating it as a proper war for so long, rather than a campaign of extermination, was the Lauric counter-invasion. When the human and halfling nation got word that their northern neighbors had been attacked, when refugees started flooding across their borders, Lauric immediately began marshalling their forces, and their parliament acted quickly to authorize a war of liberation and to appropriate funding. Many men and women, both human and halfling, joined the army until it became difficult to arm and armor all of them, because they knew that if Verandi fell, it would be only a matter of time until the Diluvians rose up from their own coast. There were several professional generals and many trained officers, but the real leader they called upon for their force was the halfling called Crystalfoot. Crystalfoot was a living legend to the people of Lauric, and was known and revered by the few, the wise, and the heroic across the continent. He had been a fairly young scion when he, with the elven wizard Madrigal, had secretly helped the Illud faction to root out traitors before they organized their separatist movement, launching the KT Civil War. But that was over 130 years before the invasion of Verandi. Halflings have about the same lifespan as humans, average 60 years or less, with 90 to 100 years being ancient for their species. But Crystalfoot, by this time, was around 160. He had grandchildren who had literally died of old age. Though the years had hobbled him, somehow he never seemed to stop moving, and his mind, if anything, had sharpened. Though he held no rank in the army, he anchored their forces with his psionic powers, and after a couple rough battles, the generals virtually abdicated their authority to Crystalfoot's own strategic vision. With the ancient halfling at the helm and pushing into the east of Verandi, other than the choke point caused by the Oron Sea, they were able to keep the fighting as far as possible from the coast, extending the enemy supply lines while marching through those areas where refugees had been naturally funneled by an enemy rising from the seas. And though, as far as anyone knows, they had no coordination with the Bronze Dragon, their actions in drawing out the enemy supply lines, in forcing them to fight army on army, and to do so a little further from their protective seas, all gave Lady Vasaris an abundance of targets. This combined affront to the Diluvians continuously forced them to draw off forces from the northern front against Vistria, turning an invasion which seemed won by the end of the first week, and which should have been consolidated within 2 years at the most, into an absolute quagmire. The Diluvians had sought to easily and cheaply crush the will of the surface nations, and to dissuade them from supporting the Illud separatists any further, and the whole thing had turned into a painful resource sink instead. In the beginning of what was intended to be a lightning war, quite a number of monitors were employed to decapitate Verandi's government and to crack open any strong bastions of defense. Although a few dedicated individuals managed to smuggle out some of the royal family through their actions and sacrifices, the monitors nevertheless achieved their objective of rapidly eliminating any coherent organization of the defenders. However, they were soon withdrawn, a valuable resource which was badly needed to balance out their Illud counterparts in the real war. But the Diluvian Emperor and his generals considered the war to be won, essentially a prolonged mopping up action. Both to the local commanders and to the distant government back in the archipelago, each setback seemed like a fluke, an error, or some feat of incompetence. There was a tremendous stubborn resistance, both of hubris and of military bureaucracy, against realizing that any surface forces could resist the armies of Baal. No, clearly that dragon was the only thing slowing their progress. They assigned many scouts as well as a powerful diviner to the task of locating Lady Viserys of the Bronze and her lair. But a dragon can traverse hundreds of miles in a day without tiring, and worse, according to their reports, the Bronze Death never struck 2 days in a row, which extended the potential range of her attacks to hundreds of miles from her base, if she was even using a consistent base of operations. And because of their mindset, their misreading of the situation, and because the whole point of the invasion was to capture Verandi using a bare minimum of resources, it took them years to realize that they needed to take the armies from the south seriously, and even longer to realize that the real problem was that decrepit halfling. Crystalfoot even defeated the first monitor they sent after him, though he was wounded in the process. But when a monitor fails in such a clear-cut mission, the next step is to send a deathfin. Nobody knows whether Crystalfoot, uninjured at the peak of his powers, could have defeated such a foe, but at his advanced age and already wounded, no amount of Yoda-like quotes and wisdom could prevent his destruction. Deprived of his protection and strategy, the Lara counter-invasion quickly crumbled, and their army was immediately decimated. Yes, 10% casualties. And then worn down further during their fighting retreat back into Laric's borders, at which point the Parliament felt they had no choice but to accept the peace bond treaty, ceding their entire coastline to the Empire, while the Empire was satisfied with the deal, having spent 10 times as long and 10 times the resources they had ever intended on the surface conflict. But for other nations, the peace bond is all that is remembered of Laric's participation in the war. Even Vistria, whose defenders benefited greatly from the splitting of Diluvian forces, received very little intelligence across the 1,000 miles of hostile territory, and were only vaguely aware of Laric's contribution even at the time. And once the conquest was complete, Lady Viserys had little choice but to pull back. She still fought against the Empire and their monstrous use of slavery, but only in limited strategic ways when opportunities presented themselves, as open conflict was no longer worth the risk without the easy target presented by moving armies. And no, Little One does not have a tail. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe to my Twitter for my silly D&D house rule of the day, and watch me play and analyze Hearthstone on my Demonac Games channel.